Hello, and welcome to another episode of the albums that shaped me. So if you watched last week's episode, it'll come as no surprise that this week's featured album of the albums that shaped me is Rush's 2112. I listened to a lot of Rush in the 70s and 80s and was actually lucky enough to see them just before they stopped touring, because they came through Nova Scotia and played at the Scotia Centre in Halifax. So I got to see them, I think it was on the Clockwork Angels tour, and we'll have a look at that in a moment. So what I'll do first of all, before I talk a little bit about how I got into the band and everything surrounding that, is I'll just give you a very quick overview of the band. So they're a Canadian rock band. They formed in Toronto in 1968. For the bulk of their career, they've consisted of Geddy Lee, Alex Lifeson and Neil Peart, and they're known for their musicianship, their complex compositions, their eclectic lyrical motifs that draw heavily on science fiction, fantasy and philosophy. The band style has changed over the years. So the very first album, they had a blues inspired hard rock sound. Then they moved into progressive rock. Then there was a period in the 80s where they really heavily used synthesizers. They'd already been using synthesizers quite a bit, but further use gave them a very 80s sound in some way. Then they went back to a more guitar-driven hard rock sound toward the end of the 80s, and then into, where we are now. Now, sadly, Neil Peart passed away in 2020, and prior to that, the band had already decided, I think in 2018, that they wouldn't continue, and their last tour was in 2015. And like I said, I saw them around 2013. But what I wanted to do is just start off, and as I've been doing with this series, try and explain how I initially heard about the band. As I've said, the band have been going for a long time, since 1968. There is one album, their first album, which does feature John Rutsey on that album. Before, in 1974, they got Neil Peart into the band, and then since then, up to his death, that's been the lineup of the band. So if you've seen last week's episode, you'll know that I mentioned a friend who I used to go round and listen to albums with, and we used to listen to Queen 2 a lot, particularly Ogre Battle. And I also mentioned that another couple of albums was Rush's 2112, particularly the track Overture, the opening track, and also Kiss Destroyer and the track, which is gone now. Oh dear, that's funny. My mind just went blank. Detroit Rock City by Kiss from Destroyer. We used to listen to that a lot. So, just listening to this album, particularly the Overture, over and over and over again, got me into the band. And the first album I bought by the band, not surprising, was 2112, although I didn't buy it when it came out. I was around probably my friend's house listening to this, I think, sometime just after or around about 1979, I reckon. So my guess here, and I'm trying to do it from memory, is I think I purchased 2112 sometime between 79 and 81. That's when I got my copy, and I still have it. And as I mentioned, I think last week, at some point I'll get around to recording a video about my record collection, or my various record collections. Well, there's a record collection, I also have a CD collection, actually. Of course, now we're in the realms of streaming. It's been a while since I bought a CD, but in actual fact, I think as of about 3 years ago, I did start buying vinyl again. And I have an interesting little themed collection for that as well, which I should go through. Anyway, back to the job in hand, talking about Rush and 2112. I was going to make a point with this, which was that up front, thinking about Rush, what did listening to Rush lead to? Well, for me, it just led to more Rush. They didn't really act as a gateway band for anything, interestingly enough. They didn't make me want to listen to more prog bands, because as far as I was concerned, Rush were like the best progressive rock band out there, and why would I want to listen to anything else? And most of the other stuff that I was listening to around that time wasn't inspired directly as a result of Rush, but could definitely be put into the same hard rock area. They weren't progressive rock bands. And so I was like listening to those in parallel as well. And in later episodes, I'm sure loads of those bands are going to come up. And today I've noticed as well, some of those will already get mentioned as being, parallel bands that were around that period and gained ascendancy from around sort of 76 onwards, which is really, I suppose, I always associate Rush as really starting to take off around 2112. They had a number of albums before that, which we'll take a look at in a moment, but that to me is when they started their ascendancy. And as I've said, I probably got to really properly listen to them around sometime 79, maybe 78 to 79 possibly. So I thought it'd be interesting to look at what else was out in 76. Funnily enough, in the same month. So if we go down here, and you can see we're in March, and the album was released on April the 1st, 1976. So it makes it interesting to sort of go back to the previous month. And as you can see, you've already caught this already, Destroyer by Kiss came out. Sad Wings of Destiny. All of these albums are albums that I later listened to a lot, but at the time, I wasn't buying albums. Yep, so Sad Wings of Destiny, Jailbreak by Thin Lizzy. So I suspect, all of these albums are going to feature in a future episode. And we go down. This was later on in Wishbone's Ash career. I'm not too familiar with this. I am familiar with this period, but not this album. I have Wishbone Ash albums from before this period, and I think maybe after it. I'm not sure when. I'm not sure chronologically where this was. Anyway, it's like I said, not an album that I've ever listened to. And then we have 2112. Klaus Schulze I didn't really start listening to until, the streaming era really, via someone I met through I became friends with through a film course in the 2000s. By G. So wow, 6th album by then. Oh, there we go, the Ramones album. First Ramones album was out, same month. Band I got into quite a bit later, and I'm sure I'll be featuring them in a later episode. High Voltage, AC/DC. I think my youngest brother owned a copy of that. That was the international debut. And then so on. We've got Rocks by Aerosmith in May there. Agents of Fortune. Yeah, this again a lot later, so yeah, probably around 79, 80. Yeah, maybe 1980 when I stayed on at school a year. Because in the UK you take some major exams at 16, and I didn't do quite as well as I thought I would do in my exams. Originally I was going to stay on for 2 years after that doing A-levels, but I just stayed on a year to do some additional studying and do some resits. And I just remember in the sixth form common room this album being on all the time, Agents of Fortune. And There's No Heavy Petting by UFO. So some pretty cool stuff. 1976, really interesting year for like hard rock, early sort of heavy metal. Nine on a 10 scale. And I have this, not so much a theory, but for me, my favourite period, my longer period in music, it runs from about 76 to around 81, which funnily enough sort of coincides with my teenage years. So yeah, I'll read into that whatever I will, but it's as you go down this, every time I look down 1976, like albums that were released that year, I get a big smile on my face. And lots of other interesting stuff like that, albums like this, which a lot of people aren't aware of necessarily unless you're a big Ian Gillan fan, Child in Time, which was done between him leaving Deep Purple and Ian Gillan Band becoming Gillan. Those sort of things. So the other thing I wanted to look at up, because also sometime in 1980 into 81, I can remember having discussions about Rush in the sixth form common room, because there was an album at the time, and that would have probably been Moving Pictures. That came out in February, and I left school in 81 around about May, June time, I think. And I can remember chatting to somebody about Rush, and they were talking about a Rush gig they'd been to, and through sort of working backwards through this, I've worked out that it must have been this tour that they saw in 1980, June 1980. So that discussion I had with them was probably, must have been, I think it was around the time of the album. But like I said, it again a bit hazy on these years, because I didn't keep a diary back then, and it is a long time ago, like over 40 years ago. So I'm doing well to remember a lot of this. But there's a bright that would have been close to where I lived. I didn't, even though I was into them at that point, there was no way I could get to gigs like this. The first album that I bought when it came out, and this is a common thing I'm doing through these episodes, so what album did I first hear, the whole album, what was the first album that I bought, and what was the first album that I bought around the time it came out. So in the case of Rush, the first album I heard was 2112, Round of Friends. First album I bought was 2112, and the first album that I bought in the contemporaneous to when it came out would be Exit Stage Left. And that was in 1981. So let's take a look at what else was coming out that time. So there it is. We've got the Best of Blondie. Lots of best ofs and greatest hits here. 81. Sonic Attack by Hawkwind. I went to see them a bit later live. Possibly in 82. Maybe sometime after that. Denim and Leather. Yeah, my youngest brother was big into Saxon. Got Ghost in the Machine by the Police. That was a big. My brother was a big fan, or my middle brother was a big fan of the Police. Rock Until You Drop, I remember. So this is an interesting period for me because October, by then I would have started my first job, so I had a bit of disposable income. And so I was buying a few albums then. I remember getting this not long after it came out because I heard them play I Don't Need Your Money, Honey on the radio actually. This was the second album. So I actually bought that on cassette when it came out. I'm not sure why I bought that on cassette at the time. Because I wouldn't have had a car at that point. But I remember getting that pretty early on. Let's just go back. Rage in Eden by Ultravox. Didn't really get into Ultravox till a little bit later. Oh yeah. My middle brother, who I mentioned, liked the Police. This was another band he was big into. Allied Forces by Triumph. I was trying to work out how, I think I mentioned last week, like, I remember both of my brothers having some money, and we never got pocket money, so it was either birthday money, but I did mention that they had a car washing enterprise when they were really young, which basically consisted of them going around with buckets and sponges and fairy liquid and knocking on people's doors asking if they wanted their car washed. Of course, the person who owned the car, they supplied the water, and it was cool because my dad really encouraged them, and I remember him buying them buckets and sponges and would give them, this washing up liquid. They used to get through a ton of washing up liquid. It was really funny, and they just come back like from doing cars just absolutely soaked, and their shoes full of water. Oh yeah, I remember buying this, made in Japan. So yeah, I was buying quite a few things. Night of the Demon by Demon, yeah, okay, so this is an interesting period. High and Dry, yeah, okay. Pleasant Dreams, another one. I'm going back a bit here. So, oh yeah, No Sleep Till Hammersmith, no doubt we'll get to mention Motorhead in a future episode. And then other bands that I've gone on to get into a lot later, like Psychedelic Furs, Susie and the Banshees, even like Duran Duran. That was a little bit later I got exposed to them. Although, actually, no, because thinking about it, later on in the year, in 81, I was going to college. The place I worked used to send us to college, and I used to go one day a week, and the person I used to go to college with actually was a bit older than me and had a car, so he used to give me a lift in the evenings when we used to go over in the evening. And I remember he used to be playing Duran Duran all the time, so I got exposed to that later in the year. I forgot about that. Yeah, Killing Joke, didn't know much about them at the time. That must be the second Bryan Adams album. So yeah, quite a lot going on in 81, and I definitely was then buying quite a number of albums because I had an income. Albums and alcohol. Yes. And what I didn't spend on that, I was saving up for a car, I suppose, because I was starting to have driving lessons as well. Actually, maybe driving lessons not until I was 18, so yeah. It's following year, really. yeah, so much stuff here that I then went on to listen to a lot later, like Bauhaus Mask. So yeah, and as I said, the period in music that I feel most what's the word I pull towards or have fondest memories of and enjoy listening to is like from about 76 through to 81. I mean, I love music from all eras, but there's something I find real magical about that period. So just to talk a little bit about the general discography and at what point, because for me it's very rare that I keep buying a band unless the band only exists for a fairly short period of time. I think with me I'm pretty lucky if I get like a 4-album run with a band. There are a number of bands where that isn't the case, and Rush is one of them, where I did a lot of infilling. Judas Priest is another band, and when I get round to going through my vinyl, you'll see the sort of bands where I infilled a lot on vinyl. And so, as I've said, the first album I listened to, 2112, then 81 was interesting because Moving Pictures came out, but also the one I mentioned, which was Exit Stage Left, the live album. And for some reason, I don't know why, I didn't buy Moving Pictures. That actually came out while I was still at school. But I did buy eventually on cassette. So what was happening, I think, between around 79, which is when I think I bought 2112, and 81, I slowly started to infill this stuff. And then carried on really a little bit after Moving Pictures came out. But then didn't actually buy anything. I didn't buy Signals, didn't buy Grace Under Pressure. I didn't buy anything really until Hold Your Fire in 87. But also the other thing about this is, rather than buying these 3 albums back towards the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s, as part of infilling, I actually bought this, which is this thing called Rush Archives, which features all 3 of those albums together. So that's how I managed that, and that was a pretty reasonable price at the time. Now, I didn't really get to see Rush until the Clockwork Angels tour, which is when they came through Halifax. Album came out in 2012, and the tour, if I go down here, let me try and find the dates. So you can see there's sort of Canadian dates interspersed here on the various legs of the tour. They did visit the UK actually, played the O2 Arena in there. And there it is. They actually played 2 nights at the Metro Centre. Yeah, that was pretty cool seeing them. The only problem with it is that tickets sold out real quick. And I remember we had seats pretty high up on like the upper levels. Fortunately, there was a lot of screens there. But yeah, it was pretty difficult to see the band from there. We were sort of quite far up and quite far back. But fortunately, as I said, there were screens on those levels, so that helped. But yeah, it was a good gig. I actually can't remember who, if anybody, supported them at the time. Also bought a number of videos by the band. Well, actually 2 DVDs. This one, Rush Beyond the Lighted Stage. I actually watched that at the cinema as well. And there's a really nice bit at the end, which it's probably my favourite part of the film, where they have the this dinner with Rush at the hunting lodge, which is an extended version of the footage shown during the film's closing credits. And I really enjoy this. It's a wonderful sort of heartwarming dinner. Just yeah. So I would definitely recommend, if you haven't seen this, check it out. It's really good. Also, we have a copy of this in the house as well, and the DVD for the Time Machine tour as well. Just, I think, pretty much a straight concert. There is a few bits and pieces on there as well, and that was obviously recorded before we saw them in 2013. And like I said, Rush just led to more Rush at the time, and every other band that I got into really came through a different route, if you like. There wasn't anything necessarily connected directly to me getting into Rush, or at least not that I can remember. So this is just me checking the concerts out. So one thing I did want to do in this episode, as I've done in previous ones, is run some lookups. Okay, let me just stop that. It's decided it wants to talk about the Permanent Waves tour. I was trying to get dates on that because I was having real problems remembering, like I said, that story about me having a discussion with, and in the end I did it. The easiest thing I did was what I should have done, which was to go through their website, and everything's listed on there. So that was quite handy to be able to do that. One thing I wanted to do, and I've got a prompt ready to go for this, just got to find it. And you saw this in the previous episode. So I just want to do this so I can see what comes up. And this is the prompt if you haven't seen the previous episode that I did on Queen, on Night at the Opera. So I've recently been listening to the band Rush. Can you tell me those most popular studio album? Then can you create a table that lists 5 bands that started in the same era that create music in a similar style as the aforementioned band, and for each of the bands explain your choice and also suggest a studio album by each band that will be considered to be their most popular. So that's what we do with that. And so I'm saying, the same era. I'm going to run another one. It's the same question, but it's not saying the same era. And we'll just see what we get. So popular studio album, Moving Pictures. That's cool. So I'm just getting something else queued up here, so we can take a look at this through a different lens, something that again I've spoken about before. So what have we got? Yes, Genesis, Led Zeppelin, so no surprise there. I remember when I listened to the first album, was reading retrospective reviews, they as often, and that was when Rutsey was the drummer and not Piet. There's a lot of similarities, or there's comparisons between Rush and Led Zeppelin, like influence-wise, in much the same way as people have done a similar thing over the years with that first Queen album. I think I mentioned that in the previous episode. So we've got Pink Floyd and Canvas. I meant to say Kansas. So of these bands, definitely listen to all of these. I have a number of albums by these bands. Yes, Genesis, Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd and Kansas. Although, quite a while after I got into Rush, funnily enough, the band I probably listened to first after listening to Rush, well, where I went out and bought an album would be Led Zeppelin, which is Led Zeppelin 4. With Yes, someone gave me Close to the Edge, one of my brothers actually. But like I said, none of this was a result of necessarily listening to Rush, not directly anyway. It was just having a wider interest in rock generally, and a curiosity, I think, about prog rock, I suppose. But I think all of these bands also, apart from Kansas, I'd heard on the radio as well. Probably prior to hearing Rush, funnily enough. So let me try the other one, which is just without the era part of the prompt. So what we should get is more contemporaneous artists, but it will probably include some of the artists we've seen already. But I wouldn't say, apart from those bands or some other bands being put into the same category of progressive rock, to me nobody really sounds like Rush, or sounded like Rush at the time. Now, you could say that you've got bands now or later that came along later which have a sound closer to Rush, or there's aspects in their sound that make them sound a little Rush-like. And you've got very technical progressive metal bands like Dream Theater, Yes makes the list again, Tool, Coheed and Cambria, and I can definitely hear like elements of Rush in this band. And then we have Porcupine Tree. It's interesting, I've not listened to much Porcupine Tree, so listen to Dream Theater. I have a couple of Dream Theater albums I mentioned about. Yes, Tool, only a couple of albums. Coheed and Cambria, I actually saw them live, but I'm trying to remember when. I think they might have been supporting Metallica when they played the Commons in Halifax, if my memory's correct. I think I might have listened to one Porcupine Tree album, maybe. It's always interesting to see what this comes up with, and whether it comes up with any bands I've listened to. And again, just bring this up again. So this is as a result of some programs I've written in Python to do API lookups. This one's from LastFM. So if you sort of look down the list, you can sort of see what that's pulling up. Oh, Triumph, interesting. Meridian, yeah. So, very proggy. Indeed. And you can see, similarity scores. Once it gets down below about 0.5, then things get a little bit more varied, I think. And then this other thing I do in Spotify, using Spotify similar bands down to 2 levels, and then work out what names come up again and again. Interesting. Ted Nugent, Batman Turner, Overdrive, Sammy Hagar, Montrose. So that's more like, basically people clearly are listening who like Rush, like those bands, but there's no real musical similarity. I mean, Triumph for a 3-piece, and I suppose some of their songs historically do sound a little bit Rush-like. And the other thing actually I was going to mention, I do have a bit of a soft spot generally, I think, for 3-pieces. I'm always impressed by the amount of noise a 3-piece can make, particularly bands like Rush, Motorhead are another good example, Triumph, and then there's all these other, there's some 2-piece bands out there that make a impressive noise. I was listening to, Bell Witch the other day, completely different style of music, but what they managed to achieve sonically as just a 2-piece is incredible. But yeah, I have a bit of a soft spot for loud, 3-piece bands who are able to fill the space, to fill the sonic space, and definitely Rush fall into that category as well. So hopefully you've enjoyed this as much as I have making it. It's been interesting trying to remember stuff and all the little tricks I have to use in Bing Chat and everything else, like to just act as an aid memoir. And that's what I'm finding it really useful for, actually. So yeah, thanks once again for watching. Bye for now, and I will catch you in the next episode.